Now, I've taught on spiritual warfare for a long period of time. Immediately after revival came to Ruth Ann and I, Brownsville, I was living in Nassau County at the time, and I certainly don't want to leave the impression Nassau County has more opportunity for spiritual warfare, but I do want you to know that the enemy is present and operational. And so I was immediately put into a situation, what I call crash course or accelerated course of spiritual warfare, beginning from zero or minus numbers perhaps, and moving into rapidly into direct confrontations and spiritual encounters. God would speak to me, and I was learning the understanding of walking in the Spirit and the prophetic. But he would speak to me and say, I want you to go to this place, and I want you to encounter this. Or he'd lead me someplace to a used bookstore, and he'd say, now go in here and I'm going to show you a book I want you to get. Well, the first book that Holy Spirit led me to read was a book by a man who lives here in Jacksonville, Christian Healing Ministries. And I read Francis McNutt's book, and that was my first book on spiritual warfare or dealing with the demonic, and all of the things that I had not learned even while earning my first doctorate. We never talked about demons or demonology. I mean, I believed in it because the Bible taught it, and I knew there was the reality of it, but that was just for folks over in other countries, Not for Americans, of course, because our pride and arrogance tells us that we couldn't have a problem like that. And then I found out we have far worse problems than many other nations. And I just continued in this vein for more than a year of pursuing this accelerated preparation, and was then exposed to Cindy Jacobs' book, Possessing the Gates of the Enemy, and other treatments of the subject before I started working on my second doctorate with Wagner Leadership Institute, which is awesome that we're here with Wagner Leadership Institute North Florida for this class. In seasons of spiritual warfare training, I've had some of the most powerful experiences of my life. One in which, teaching a class like this, the heavens opened and I was carried up in the Spirit over South America, March the 7th, 2003, right here in town when I was teaching, and stayed there about an hour and a half, prophesying what I was seeing in the vision, and it was being recorded, and that shifted my life into a whole new place of spiritual warfare and intercession, and as you know, sent me to Brazil, which I've been traveling there now more than 12 years. Talking about that vision and how the spiritual warfare aspects of that affect that culture. And the nation of Brazil is right now in its greatest challenges, some of the greatest challenges it's had for a century or more. Go back to 1909. And what God's doing there is applying many of the things that I saw in the vision. Not that I was the only one who understood them, or that I was the only one praying about them. I'm only saying that the impact of spiritual warfare on nations is something I'm completely 100% convinced is a reality and valid. And the principles I want to teach you in these 4 sessions will come from personal experience, will come from my interaction with some of what we call the heroes of spiritual warfare, so to speak, with Cindy Jacobs and Bob Beckett, Peter Wagner, and of course Dutch Sheets also was a teacher. Interaction with Mary Glazer and some other people considered to be heroes in the previous generation, George Otis Jr. and Alice Smith. And just recently we were with Becca Greenwood, Greg and Becca Greenwood in Phoenix, Arizona, honoring these pioneers and hearing them speak and rehearsing some of the same things that we're going to build on in our generation. I'm also going to offer some critique of where we've been, where we are now, and what we need to do next in this time of reset. About 2 years ago, the Holy Spirit began to speak to me that He was going to reset the prayer movement that began really in the 70s and matured into a warfare movement, you might say, in terms of its growth in the 90s. There was a beginning, Larry Lee in San Francisco, and then Cindy Jacobs in Argentina, Peter Wagner, of course, watching things happening in several areas of the world, as well as George Otis Jr. and Alice Smith, developing through experience an understanding, a greater understanding of spiritual warfare. And we've pursued that now. Here we are in 2016. We've pursued that. And I think that in doing so, we've certainly brought this generation into something absolutely necessary for this time of history, but also think that we fell short of some of the expectations that Jesus had for us. And I'm not blaming the pioneers or anyone in particular. I just think it's a strategic thing. And also an area of pride, lack of humility, and areas of discussion that we're going to talk about right now. Remember, if hell cannot keep you from, all of you who are a part of Freedom Ministry here, this at every level, if hell cannot keep you from spiritual warfare, then hell will work to limit your authority and power in spiritual warfare through distraction. And if you can buy into distraction at the right level, you then will accept substitution. And that's what happens in the power of the cross, power of Holy Spirit, and obedience without limits, as we teach, and of course in personal identity, as we teach in level 4. And so in the area of spiritual warfare, if hell cannot stop you from engaging in spiritual warfare, then hell will work to limit your authority and power and find ways to put you in a silo, put you in a cocoon, drive you into a cave, cause you to isolate or become a lone ranger, somehow short-circuit the actual biblical and kingdom principles and protocols so that you're less effective than you should be or can be. Now, our premise, first of all, about spiritual warfare, let's define terms as we begin in this principles, spiritual warfare. And tonight, I want to talk about authority, because that's our discussion point, our point of impact, our point of beginning, is that we have authority, but more importantly for you and I, we need to understand that we're authorized. Amen. In other words, we have a right to do something. That's the sense of authorization. And if we don't understand what we have a right to do, we'll do some things that we're not authorized to do, or we'll fail to do some basic things that we are authorized to do. And so we're going to get some of these principles out of the way. But my definition of spiritual warfare is this: positively pressing for the purposes of God. Period. You say, well, I don't hear anything about violence and war and demons and anything else in that. Well, you just positively press for the purpose of God and you'll run right into them. You'll never have any doubts about the reality of spiritual warfare as long as you positively press for God's purpose. Yeah. If you accept anything less, if you distracted to the point of substitution, hell will help you do something other than God's purpose. Hell will assist believers in accepting substitutes, feed religion, its substitute for spiritual reality, feed all the substitute and distractions that come through pride and rejection and shame, rebellion, fear of man, the political spirit, witchcraft, all the things that we deal with become ways for hell to repivot our spirit and to produce, and this is a good definition even of sin. Sin, the word sin itself, it's a repivoting of your life so that there's a perversion. You miss the mark. You sidestep from the call. You miss the appropriate point on the target that you would hit dead center if you were fully obedient, fully submitted, and walking straight ahead in grace, and could say what Paul said, I am what I am by God's grace. So positively pressing for the purpose of God means this: we are never defensive. We may receive defensive weaponry, but we do not posture ourselves on a defensive mood. We are always positively pressing on an offense, expanding, establishing the kingdom of God. In doing so, as Jesus said, you can divide up his discussion of ecclesia, in fact, into this, and see my definition of spiritual warfare as a definition consistent with his statement. Jesus said, I will build my ecclesia, which is his representative authority, governmental and legislative in the earth. I will build my ecclesia. Build means it's going to get bigger. Build means it's going to have a foundation. Build means it's going to expand width, breadth, height. And he, being the chief cornerstone, will lay the foundations, and then others will build on those foundations, so that there's an expansion and an establishing of ecclesia. I will do it, Jesus said. And he's doing it now. And then he said, as I do so, there will be a displacement. See, Jesus didn't say, I'm going to go out and beat up on all the demons and defeat them. He did defeat them, and now we're applying that victory. What he said was, I'm going to positively press for my Father's purposes by building an ecclesia, and then that ecclesia will displace the strategically positioned authorities of Hades. When he said, they will not be able to resist this expansion and establishment. Can I just say that when we build when Jesus builds an ecclesia, that's what happens? And that if we are building ecclesias on our own that don't do that, we need to go back to original design and definition. Because Jesus said the ecclesia that I will construct will expand and displace the gates of Hades. And what he's saying about gates is authorities that are positioned. And everyone in Jesus' generation understood that. That gates was the place where government was sat in the gate of the city. That city-states in Asia and in those parts of the world were governed by those who sat in the gates. And those that sat in the gates had authority about what would enter and what would exit. And they had governmental authority over what happened in that city-state and around that city-state. They made the decisions, they had the authority, and so they were strategically positioned. Because the gates, of course, were the strategic positions to make decisions and to enforce those decisions in government. So Jesus is saying the gates of hell will not be able to prevail. They won't be able to withstand. They'll give way. They'll be displaced by the expansion of ecclesia as I build my church. So this is why I believe that positively pressing for the purposes of God defines warfare. And I can tell you that if you don't want to have encounters with the enemy, just don't obey God. Just be passive and don't expand. And just learn how to live with your sensuality.